Part 1. A City Wrapped in Smoke. Victorian Women and the Opium Habit. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with something both quiet and strangely unsettling. So fluff your pillows, let the room go dim, and settle into the kind of story that doesn't exactly scream adventure, but more like a slow, foggy walk through Victorian London. The kind of walk where you'd trip over cobblestones, smell something vaguely unpleasant in the Thames breeze, and maybe wonder why everyone's eyes look just a little too glazed over. Because tonight, we're talking about opium, specifically the way it threaded itself through Victorian life, and, most curiously, how it wound up shaping the lives of women in that rigid, corseted society. You know, the ones supposedly devoted to fainting couches, embroidery, and endless cups of tea. But in reality, many were just quietly sipping or spooning their way into an opium haze. And here's the thing. While Victorian London was all about moral sermons, industrial smoke, and Queen Victoria pretending the empire was basically fine, there was another reality humming just under the surface. Ordinary women. Housewives, mothers, even governesses. Many were essentially medicated into docility with laudanum and its sticky cousins. Because, of course, the best way to deal with a society that barely lets you breathe was to just knock yourself out chemically. Now, before we drift into the lives of these women, let's set the stage. London, 19th century, a city of contradictions. Picture London in the mid-1800s. Streets sooty, horses everywhere, the air thick with a mix of coal smoke and optimism about steam engines. Dickens is wandering around finding inspiration in every chimney sweep and street urchin. And beneath the polished surface of progress, you have drug culture flourishing in plain sight. Opium wasn't some shady back alley indulgence. No, it was as common as cough syrup. Because it was cough syrup. You could buy laudanum, basically opium dissolved in alcohol, at your local chemist, no prescription, no questions. Need to calm a teething baby? Laudanum. Stomach cramps? Laudanum. Can't sleep because your neighbor won't stop yelling about Parliament? Laudanum. Feeling vaguely like existing as a woman in Victorian London is unbearable? Guess what? More laudanum. It was cheap too. Working-class mothers could buy it by the penny. Middle-class ladies could afford prettier bottles and perhaps even engrave Mrs. Such-and-Such's tonic, as though that made it respectable. And the upper class, they were still dosing up. They just did it with better silver spoons. Women and the bottle. Let's talk about why women in particular became poster children for the opium habit. First, society pretty much expected them to be docile, obedient, and preferably silent unless asked about dinner menus. But women also bore the brunt of raising endless children, managing households, and enduring the delights of Victorian gynecology, which was essentially men with mustaches declaring every female complaint to be hysteria. So, surprise, surprise, a doctor would prescribe opium. Nervous? Opium. Menstrual pain? Opium. Postpartum blues? Definitely opium. Or, more bluntly, if you were a woman in pain, whether physical or emotional, there was a very good chance someone would shove a tincture bottle into your hand and say, "Just a few drops, dear." And it worked. Sort of. It dulled the pain. It numbed the emotions. It blurred the sharp edges of a life where you were never really allowed to make choices. But of course, there was a catch. You'd need more. And more. Until you couldn't imagine life without it. By the 1860s, medical reports were already whispering about female laudanum habituates, which is Victorian for ladies who basically can't function without a dose. The very image of refined womanhood often masked someone quietly calculating when she could sneak away for another spoonful. And here's where it gets darkly ironic. The Victorian press occasionally fretted about opium dens in the East End, where Chinese immigrants and English sailors smoked their pipes in shadowy rooms. That was foreign, exotic, dangerous. The newspapers loved that image. So scandalous. But the truth? The more widespread addiction wasn't happening in Limehouse back alleys. It was happening in middle-class drawing rooms, right under embroidered lampshades. The respectable kind of addiction. Imagine a pale lady, lace at her wrists, sipping tea in the afternoon, politely chatting with a neighbor about the weather, while knowing she has a decanter of laudanum waiting in her cabinet. She's not scandalous, not a fallen woman, not immoral. She's just tired and medicated. And everyone pretended that was fine. Doctors, husbands, even clergymen often looked over the way, because as long as she wasn't running into the streets screaming, the system was working. And if a little chemical assistance kept women subdued in their prescribed roles, well, so much the better. Literary ladies and their bottles. Even the intellectual women weren't spared. Writers, poets, thinkers, they all dipped into opium. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, one of the most famous poets of the Victorian age, was essentially kept afloat by laudanum for much of her life. She suffered from chronic illness, and her dependence on opium was so well known it became part of her identity. And yet she wrote verses that are still admired today. Imagine trying to write about love, passion, and art while floating somewhere between coherence and haze, and still managing it better than most sober poets. Of course, that doesn't mean she didn't struggle with the side effects: nausea, withdrawal, and the creeping fear that the very thing keeping you alive might also be slowly killing you. She wasn't alone. Many lesser-known women, too. Journalists, amateur poets, even governesses, they leaned on opium to survive the grinding monotony of their positions, because nothing says make childcare tolerable than a spoonful of tincture to take the edge off. Mothers and the soothing syrup. And let's not forget the children. Yes, children, because Victorian mothers had a secret weapon: opium-laced syrups marketed specifically for babies. Popular brands like Godfrey's Cordial and Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup were sold everywhere. They promised to ease teething pain, colic, and general fussiness. Translation: if your baby won't stop crying, just knock them out with drugs. It worked so well that entire generations of working-class children were basically raised half-sedated. Infant mortality rates soared in neighborhoods where mothers leaned too heavily on the bottle. But in a world where women often worked long hours in factories or laundries, sometimes dosing the baby seemed like the only option. It's grim, but also deeply telling. Victorian society placed impossible burdens on women, gave them no safety nets, then handed them bottles of opium as a solution. The quiet epidemic. By the late 1800s, estimates suggested that women made up the majority of habitual opium users in Britain, and yet society rarely called them addicts. That word was too harsh, too unladylike. Instead, they were sufferers of the laudanum habit, a softer phrase, one that smoothed over the rough edges of reality. Meanwhile, male addicts, like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, were given more tragic, romantic treatment. For women, though, addiction was brushed under the rug, quietly endured, and rarely talked about. Let's drift to another side street. So here we are, Victorian London, a place of smoke, sermons, and secret bottles. Women hemmed in by social expectations, finding solace in little brown vials lined up on their shelves. Babies lulled into drugged sleep. Poets writing by candlelight with laudanum at their elbows. It was a world both respectable and quietly unraveling. And as we move forward, we'll meet more of these women, famous, obscure, tragic, and occasionally absurd, who lived their lives through a haze of opium. But for now, take another breath, sink into the dim light, and remember, Victorian London wasn't just about carriages, corsets, and Queen Victoria looking perpetually unimpressed. It was also about the soft clink of bottles, the syrupy taste of tinctures, and the slow, creeping epidemic that shaped a generation of women.
Part 2. Ladies of the Haze. Personal Stories of Victorian Women and Opium. So, now that we've set the stage with laudanum bottles clinking in drawing rooms and babies quietly snoozing under the influence of soothing syrups, let's drift into the lives of some of the women themselves. Because behind every dusty chemist's shelf, every handwritten medical prescription, and every delicate little vial tucked into a sewing basket, there's a story. Some are tragic, some oddly relatable, and most just quietly heartbreaking. Tonight we'll float through them one by one, without rush, the way you might glance at portraits in a gallery. Soft light, muffled footsteps, and maybe a lingering thought of, how did she even manage? Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet in the bottle. Let's start with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, because she's the kind of Victorian lady who managed to be both brilliant and perpetually ill, which, in 19th century fashion, made her almost a tragic heroine by default. She suffered from chronic lung problems, spinal pain, and general weakness from a young age, and of course, the doctors didn't have much to offer her beyond sympathy and laudanum. Because when in doubt, just pour opium into it. Elizabeth relied on it heavily, often daily, sometimes multiple times a day, and yet she still managed to write poetry that critics considered among the most passionate and vivid of her time. Imagine writing sonnets from the Portuguese, some of the most famous love poems in English, while never quite sure whether the inspiration was from love or laudanum. Her relationship with Robert Browning, her husband, was famously romantic, but one can't help imagining the quiet undercurrent. Robert writing letters about passion and art, while Elizabeth calculated her next dose to get through the day. It's both inspiring and desperately sad, because while she escaped her domineering father, she never escaped her bottle. Sarah Coleridge. Daughter of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet who gave us Kubla Khan after one particularly opium-soaked vision. And yes, like father, like daughter. Sarah inherited not only her father's literary talent, but also his reliance on laudanum. Unlike her father, though, Sarah's addiction was quieter, less dramatic. She wasn't wandering around ranting about ancient mariners. She was a mother, a writer, and a woman trying to juggle the endless small duties of life. She used opium to manage both physical ailments and emotional burdens, which honestly makes sense. Imagine growing up in the shadow of a brilliant but erratic addict, marrying, raising children, writing, editing, all while Victorian society demanded you smile politely and keep the tea warm. Of course you'd reach for something soothing. Her letters revealed the same familiar cycle: pain, relief, dependence, shame, and resignation. It's a loop that countless Victorian women found themselves trapped in, and Sarah Coleridge, educated, talented, socially respectable, was no exception. The anonymous millions, housewives and servants. But most of the women who leaned on opium weren't poets or literary celebrities. They were anonymous, unrecorded. The millions who left no memoirs, only hints in medical records and coroner's reports. Think of a laundress, working 12-hour days in hot steam, scrubbing linen until her skin cracked. She goes home to children crying, a husband drunk or absent, and a body that aches everywhere. For a penny, she can buy laudanum to ease her pain, calm the kids, and, just for a while, make life bearable. Or the middle-class housewife, expected to keep a perfect home, entertain politely, and never once complain about nerves, exhaustion, or the sheer monotony of endless sewing. Her doctor hands her a bottle of laudanum with a knowing nod. It doesn't fix her loneliness, but it blunts it. These women never appear in history books by name, but they're the quiet majority who consumed opium by the spoonful, day after day, until it was simply part of existence. They weren't scandalous or rebellious, and even noticed, just ordinary women managing extraordinary burdens with the only escape they were allowed. The doctor's dilemma: helpful or harmful? Of course, the medical men eventually noticed. Doctors began to publish case studies of the laudanum habit in females. The tone was often patronizing, sympathetic but judgmental, as though women's weak wills were the problem rather than the complete lack of alternative treatments. One case described a respectable lady who began with 2 or 3 drops nightly for sleep, and within a year was up to multiple ounces a day. Another told of a mother who gave her infant laudanum so often that both mother and child showed signs of dependence. Doctors wrung their hands but rarely cut off supply because, well, what else could they give her? Aspirin hadn't been invented yet, therapy was not a concept, and telling a Victorian woman to just deal with it was basically the default medical practice anyway. So laudanum kept flowing. Doctors might sigh about it in journals, but they kept prescribing. Pharmacies kept selling, and women kept drinking. The gentle slide from use to dependence. It's worth pausing to notice how gentle the slide into addiction was. Laudanum didn't come with a warning label or a skull and crossbones. It came in pretty bottles with nice labels like Godfrey's Cordial or Bately's Sedative Solution. You didn't wake up one morning deciding to be an addict. You started with a few drops for sleeplessness. Then, the next time, a little more. Over months and years, doses increased until you weren't sure whether you took it for pain or simply because your body screamed without it. And unlike the sensational opium dens that haunted the Victorian imagination, female addiction wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A spoonful before bed, a dose after nursing the baby, another before company came over to steady the nerves. Addiction didn't arrive with scandal, it crept in with respectability. The social silence. And here lies the irony. Victorian society thrived on talking about morality, sin, and temptation. There were endless sermons about alcohol, gambling, prostitution, and foreign vices. But the widespread opium use among respectable women, that was politely ignored. Why? Because acknowledging it would have meant confronting uncomfortable truths, that women were miserable, that society gave them no outlet but chemical numbness, and that the empire's great moral backbone was built on shaky legs held upright by tincture bottles. Much easier to wring hands about sailors smoking opium pipes in East End dens far away from middle-class respectability than to admit half your neighbors were dosing themselves nightly. Drifting toward the century's end. As the 19th century crept toward its close, awareness of the problem grew. By the 1870s and 1880s, medical journals carried more frequent warnings, and lawmakers began considering restrictions. Slowly, laudanum's grip loosened as new medicines arrived and regulations tightened. But for decades, opium had already done its quiet work. It dulled pain, smoothed over despair, and shaped the private lives of countless Victorian women. Some lived full lives despite their habit, others wasted away, their stories ending quietly in obituaries that never mentioned of bottles or doses. A pause before we continue. So that's where we'll pause, at least for now, hovering in parlors, nurseries, and bedrooms among the women who leaned on opium just to get through the day. From poets scribbling by candlelight to laundresses barely surviving, they all shared the same tiny bottles, the same bitter taste, the same relief, and the same trap. And in part 3, we'll keep gliding deeper into the public debates, the caricatures, and the way Victorian culture both relied on and condemned its quiet epidemic. But for tonight, just hold on to the image. lace gloves folded neatly on a table, a polished bottle of laudanum nearby, and a woman, respectable, tired, unseen, lifting the spoon that kept her going.
Part 3. Respectability, Panic, and the Victorian Opium Debate. So far, we've been peeking into parlors and bedrooms, catching glimpses of women quietly measuring out their nightly doses. But society at large eventually had to notice. Because you can only have so many poets fainting into their manuscripts, so many babies soothed into oblivion, before the public starts asking questions. And in true Victorian fashion, when people did begin to talk about opium, they did so with a combination of denial, moral panic, and of course, class prejudice. Because nothing says 19th century Britain like worrying loudly about the poor and foreign addicts while ignoring the polite lady next door with her laudanum spoon. The Great Hypocrisy. Let's begin with the obvious. Britain was simultaneously running one of the world's largest opium trades and wringing its hands about addiction. It's almost impressive the level of doublethink involved. On one hand, British merchants backed by the empire itself were shipping opium to China on an industrial scale, sparking not one, but 2 wars when Chinese officials tried to stop the trade. Opium was a pillar of imperial revenue. Entire fortunes, entire towns even, were built on the profits. On the other hand, Victorian moralists in London were clutching their pearls about the evils of opium right at home. Not in drawing rooms, of course, but in the smoky East End dens where Chinese immigrants and English sailors gathered. You see, that kind of opium use was dangerous. Exotic, foreign, un-English. Respectable laudanum in crystal bottles, perfectly fine. Foreign pipes in dim rooms, a national crisis. The scandal of the dens. The opium den became a kind of cultural obsession in the latter half of the 19th century. Novelists loved them, newspaper illustrators loved them. They were the perfect symbol of all things sinister and decadent. Charles Dickens, never one to resist a moody atmosphere, put an opium den into The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Later, Arthur Conan Doyle had Sherlock Holmes wander into them when he needed to solve a case. To Victorian readers, dens meant danger, crime, corruption, the slippage of society into darkness. And yet, statistically speaking, most addicts weren't in dens. They were middle-class women at home dosing themselves discreetly. But of course, that was much less exciting to imagine. You couldn't very well set your detective novel in Mrs. Jenkins' drawing room while she quietly sipped laudanum after tea. The dens gave a villainous foreign other to blame, and Victorians loved having something, anything foreign to point a finger at. Doctors, clergy, and moralists. By the mid-19th century, medical men began writing more openly about opium's dangers. Some doctors published warnings, others lamented their patients' dependence, but the language was always gentle when describing women. They were sufferers, unfortunate ladies caught in a habit. Meanwhile, men with addictions were more likely to be portrayed as reckless, immoral, even criminal. Clergymen also weighed in. Sermons against alcohol were already common, so why not toss opium into the mix? The trouble was, denouncing opium too loudly risked offending half the respectable ladies in the pews. And so, religious critiques often targeted the dens, those dark, foreign places, while quietly skipping over the medicine cabinets in respectable homes. Cartoons and caricatures. Victorian satirical magazines loved to poke at social problems, but when it came to opium, their targets were very selective.
Caricatures often showed lazy, pipe-smoking Chinese men sprawled in opium stupors, figures meant to embody the supposed moral weakness of foreigners. Meanwhile, the middle-class Englishwoman with her laudanum bottle rarely appeared in cartoons. If she did, she was usually drawn with pity, never ridicule. Addiction was something that could be mocked in others, but when it touched respectable women, it was treated as an unfortunate medical misstep, not a moral failing. Class, gender, and the double standard. This is the heart of the hypocrisy. A poor woman in the East End caught buying laudanum for her baby might be condemned as negligent, even criminal. A middle-class lady doing the exact same thing was overwhelmed by her delicate nerves. Men addicted to opium were either tragic geniuses or disgraceful failures. Women addicted were fragile sufferers. Foreign addicts were villains. It was all about context, who you were, where you lived, and how you looked while consuming the same drug. Addiction wasn't a universal condition. It was a social mirror. And in Victorian London, that mirror had very selective lighting. The push for regulation. By the late 1860s and 1870s, reports began piling up. Child deaths linked to soothing syrups, women wasting away on laudanum, workers barely functional. The government eventually decided maybe, just maybe, it should do something. The first steps were mild, new labeling requirements, encouragements to limit dosages. By the 1890s, the first real controls appeared. Pharmacies had to record sales, bottles had to carry warnings. Still, opium remained widely available well into the early 20th century. And yet, these changes came too late for the countless women who had already spent decades dosing themselves into dependency. Regulations may have signaled the end of an era, but they didn't erase the lives already shaped, sometimes shortened, by the habit. The quiet disappearance. As the Victorian age faded into the Edwardian, the public image of opium addiction shifted. The respectable lady with her laudanum bottle slowly disappeared from view, replaced in cultural imagination by the shady den, the foreign smoker, or the bohemian artist. Women's dependence on laudanum became something polite society didn't like to discuss anymore, as though the entire phenomenon had been a collective embarrassment. By the time the 20th century arrived, the memory of the epidemic had blurred into a faint whisper, just another quirk of the strange, foggy Victorian era. A gentle transition. So, in this part of our quiet wander through history, we've seen how Victorian culture managed to hold two opposing ideas at once, condemning opium as a foreign vice while simultaneously sipping it at home in the name of respectability. We've seen doctors wring their hands, clergymen avoid awkward truths, and newspapers sketch sinister caricatures while ignoring the addiction next door. It was, in short, a society that depended on silence. Silence about women's pain, silence about their coping mechanisms, silence about the empire's hypocrisy. And yet, beneath the silence, bottles still clinked, spoons still dipped, and women still drifted through life on clouds of opium. Where we're heading. In Part 4, we'll drift even further into the cultural legacy. How did Victorian women's opium use echo in literature, in art, in the image of the tragic woman? How did it shape stories long after the bottles were empty? And what does it tell us really about the strange, foggy heart of Victorian society? But for now, just rest in the image. A city of chimneys, gaslight glows, and behind the lace curtains, countless women leaning quietly on the drug that society both ignored and depended upon.
Part 4. The Literary Ghosts of Laudanum. So far, we've wandered through parlors and pharmacies, traced laudanum bottles into women's hands, and listened to society loudly fret about dens while ignoring the medicine cabinet. But the Victorians left something behind, beyond bottles and regulations. They left stories. And like most things Victorian, those stories were messy, melodramatic, and dripping with irony. Because once opium slipped into the bloodstream of the culture, it didn't just vanish when the dose wore off. It lingered in books, in art, in how people imagined women, illness, and suffering. Tonight, we float into that haze. Literature, art, and the lingering image of the fragile, laudanum-soaked lady. Opium in the pages. Victorian writers had a habit of weaving opium into their works, not always directly, but often as a shadow in the background. Some did it because they were users themselves, others because opium had become such a recognizable part of life that readers instantly understood the reference. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry sometimes carried the strange intensity of someone writing on the edge of pain and relief. Her sonnets are remembered as passionate declarations of love, but hidden in the margins of her life was the constant presence of laudanum. You could almost imagine her verse floating out through a haze, shaped by both love and tincture. Then there's Christina Rossetti, another Victorian poet, who battled illness and was treated with, you guessed it, opium-based medicines. Her poems often touch on longing, melancholy, and spiritual yearning. Were those themes simply personal, or did the tincture at her bedside whisper into the lines? Hard to say. But the cultural association of women, fragility, and narcotics was becoming part of the Victorian literary DNA. Opium as symbol. For male writers, opium often became a symbol of decadence, danger, or exotic temptation. Think Thomas de Quincey with his Confessions of an English Opium Eater, a dramatic account that made addiction sound both terrifying and oddly glamorous. His book turned opium into a literary theme, something half romantic, half nightmarish. But for women, opium as symbol was different. In literature and art, the opium-using woman often stood for fragility, faintness, and tragic beauty. She was the pale, lace-wrapped figure wasting away in a sick room, her hand weakly reaching for the vial. Not dangerous, not decadent, just delicate. It was the perfect Victorian stereotype, the woman as weak, suffering, and in need of both male care and medical crutches. And if those crutches came in liquid form, well, that only made her more picturesque. The fallen woman trope. Of course, Victorians loved their melodramas. In some novels and plays, opium pushed women toward ruin. A fallen woman wasn't just someone who strayed romantically. She might also be shown slipping into addiction, her respectability dissolving along with her health. This was less about realism and more about moral theater. Opium became another way to signal decline, corruption, tragedy. And usually, the story ended with the woman dying quietly, thus restoring moral balance. Because heaven forbid she recover and live happily ever after, Victorian audiences preferred their addicts pale and buried. Art, paintings, and pale ladies. The art world, too, picked up the theme. Pre-Raphaelite painters loved their sickly, dreamy women. Those long-necked figures reclining in bed, eyes half-closed, lips parted, as though whispering poetry or prayers. They weren't always explicitly linked to opium, but the imagery resonated with the cultural association of women, fragility, and narcotic haze. Paintings of fainting women, of swooning figures, of sickbeds adorned with flowers, all echoed the same aesthetic. Suffering was beautiful. Illness was spiritual. And the quiet reality that many of these women were medicated into numbness rarely appeared on the canvas. Echoes in the Gothic. Even the Gothic genre, always eager for a good metaphor, leaned on the theme. Women drifting between life and death, heroines caught in trances, visions, dreams, they all carried faint echoes of laudanum. The drug itself might not be named, but its presence hovered, unspoken, in the endless fascination with altered states. And what's more gothic, really, than an entire society running on a quiet chemical fog while pretending everything is under control? The empire may have been conquering the globe, but in its parlors and nurseries, women were conquering their despair with teaspoons of tincture. Legacy beyond the Victorians. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, opium use shifted into different cultural narratives. The laudanum lady of the Victorian era slowly gave way to the jazz-age morphine addict, the 20th century heroin user. But the image of women and drugs, fragile, tragic, passive, lingered. Even in modern portrayals, echoes of the Victorian archetype remain. Think of the trope of the pale, suffering woman numbed by substances, her addiction framed as sadness rather than danger. That idea didn't start in the 20th century. It was born in the lace curtains of Victorian drawing rooms. A quiet irony. And so we return to the irony at the heart of it all. Victorian women used opium because society gave them no other tools to survive. Literature, art, and culture then turned their suffering into an aesthetic. Beautiful, tragic, moral, symbolic. Their real lives, the pain and dependence and quiet despair, got blurred into tropes. What remained in cultural memory wasn't the woman struggling at her kitchen table, but the pale muse, reclining in poetic haze. A fiction born from a chemical reality. Drifting to the next part. So in this section, we floated through the ghostly afterimages, poetry whispered through laudanum, pale figures immortalized in paint, novels that turned real suffering into moral lessons. And in part 5, we'll wander further into the day-to-day texture of Victorian women's lives with opium, how it shaped marriage, motherhood, even fashion. Because believe it or not, addiction even left its mark on corsets and beauty ideals. But for now, picture the scene: a candlelit room, verses scattered on a desk, a bottle glinting beside it, and a woman caught between inspiration and oblivion. That's the cultural shadow laudanum left behind, and it never fully faded.
Part 5. Marriage, Motherhood, and the Corseted Haze. When we picture Victorian domestic life, we often see lace curtains, stiff collars, obedient children, and the steady tick of the parlor clock. Respectability, routine, and control. But beneath all that, a quiet fog of opium wove through daily rituals, shaping how women lived as wives, mothers, and fashionable figures. Because laudanum wasn't just medicine. It was woven into the rhythms of marriage, into the struggles of motherhood, even into the bodily ideals that corsets squeezed into shape. Let's step into the drawing room, the nursery, and the dressing chamber, and watch the tincture at work. Marriage in a bottle. Victorian marriages were often less about romance and more about duty. Women were expected to maintain the home, provide heirs, and manage domestic order, all while appearing serene and angelic. Not an easy job, especially when real life involved pain, childbirth, grief, and very little agency. Enter laudanum. For many wives, the drug became a kind of marriage aid. It soothed nerves during arguments, quieted anxieties about pregnancies, dulled the sting of miscarriages. Some husbands even encouraged its use, preferring their wives tranquil and compliant rather than restless or outspoken. The irony is hard to miss. Women were praised for their calm, selfless demeanor, while the very substance that enabled that calm was rarely acknowledged. The perfect Victorian wife was often just a teaspoon away from collapse. The opium nursery. Nowhere was opium's role more evident and more tragic than in the nursery. Mothers struggling with endless crying, sleepless nights, and the crushing pressure to maintain respectability often turned to soothing syrups for their children. Products like Godfrey's Cordial or Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup promised relief from teething, colic, or restlessness.
What they delivered was sedation. Babies lulled into unnatural quiet, sometimes fatally. For mothers, these syrups offered precious hours of peace. But they also created guilt and dependency. Children became weaker, more fragile, and mothers more reliant on the bottle. It was a vicious cycle of love, desperation, and ignorance. And for the mothers themselves, many reached for their own tincture once the nursery was quiet, numbing the exhaustion with laudanum, just as they numbed their children with syrup. Entire families drifted through the haze together. The fashionable sufferer. Victorian fashion was not designed for comfort. Corsets cinched waists, bustles distorted posture, and layers of fabric restricted movement. Women were expected to look delicate, pale, and refined, an aesthetic that already echoed illness. But here's the twist. Laudanum use actually reinforced this fashionable frailty. The drug caused weight loss, pallor, and languid movements, all qualities celebrated in the beauty ideals of the day. A woman weakened by tincture might be praised for her ethereal grace. Her lack of appetite, her dreamy gaze, her tendency to faint, all perfectly on trend. Fashion and addiction blurred together, until it was hard to tell where the corset ended and the tincture began. Motherhood in the fog. Addiction complicated motherhood in profound ways. Some women struggled to balance care for their children with dependence on laudanum. Diaries tell of mothers writing about guilt, exhaustion, and the strange double life of being both caretaker and patient. For many, laudanum was framed not as indulgence, but as a necessity. How else could they manage chronic illness, repeated pregnancies, and the pressure of perfection? The drug allowed them to function, but at the cost of clarity and connection. The Victorian angel in the house ideal, gentle, nurturing, serene, was often chemically sustained. Behind the myth of maternal devotion lay a quieter reality, a woman swallowing her struggles along with her daily dose. Domestic dependence. The availability of laudanum created a domestic pattern. A wife dependent on medicine, a husband either oblivious or enabling, and a household quietly shaped by bottles kept in drawers. For some women, the drug became a companion more reliable than their spouses. Addiction also created tensions. Some husbands complained about wives taking to the bottle, not meaning gin, but tincture. Others relied on laudanum themselves and mirrored their wives' dependence. Marriage became a quiet partnership in sedation, a foggy truce maintained by routine doses. When fashion meets fragility. There's one last irony worth savoring. Victorian women's bodies were already under immense pressure from fashion. Corsets reshaped them, fountain couches waited for collapses, and doctors insisted fragility was feminine. Laudanum only amplified the effect, turning real suffering into a fashionable aesthetic. To be pale, thin, and weak was not a sign of addiction, it was a sign of refinement. Society admired the very symptoms of dependence, mistaking illness for elegance. Women were praised for embodying ideals that were, in many cases, sustained by narcotics. A house of glass. Step back and the picture sharpens. A respectable Victorian household was often propped up by opium. Wives dosed themselves to endure duty. Mothers dosed children to keep order. Fashion celebrated the symptoms of addiction, and marriages ran smoother when everyone drifted just a little quieter. The home, that shining symbol of moral stability, was in fact a fragile glass house, its foundations softened by tincture, its angel glowing with the pallor of narcotic haze. Drifting to the next part. So, in part 5, we've peered into daily life, the parlor, the nursery, and the corset-laced dressing chamber, all fogged by opium. In Part 6, we'll widen the view again. We'll see how class shaped opium use, how working-class women relied on it differently than the wealthy, how doctors prescribed it unevenly, and how the myth of respectable use masked very real divisions. But for now, let the image linger. A woman seated by the fire, corset pressing against her ribs, children finally silent upstairs, and a husband quietly reading. And beside her teacup, the little brown bottle, always waiting, always ready. Part 6. Class, Inequality, and the Quiet Epidemic. Victorian society loved its hierarchies. Class was everywhere, in dress, in accent, in access to education, and of course, in access to opium. Women of different social standing experienced addiction differently, and society treated them differently as well. Because one thing about laudanum is universal. It doesn't care if you have a silver spoon or a wooden one. But the consequences, perception, and daily integration of the drug varied dramatically across social lines. Working-class women. Let's start with working-class women. They were often doing brutal, exhausting labor. Laundries, factories, markets, domestic service. 12 to 14-hour days were standard, and medical care was minimal. Pain, fatigue, and postpartum recovery were constant companions. Opium, or laudanum-based tonics, offered a cheap, accessible solution. A few pennies could buy temporary relief. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't literary, it was survival. But dependence had costs. Unlike middle-class women, working-class mothers couldn't afford to hide their use. If a baby was sedated with Godfrey's cordial or a mother nodded off mid-task, neighbors, employers, and local authorities noticed. Children could suffer neglect, and social services, nascent though they were, sometimes intervened. And yet, for these women, opium was a practical lifeline. It dulled pain and fear, gave a moment's peace, and allowed them to keep going. In other words, it was survival wrapped in quiet tragedy. Middle-class women. Middle-class women occupied a different world. They had more resources, more privacy, and more expectations. Doctors were readily available. Laudanum could be prescribed for nerves, for sleeplessness, or for weak digestion. These women's dependence was socially invisible. They could sip at home, dose children discreetly, and maintain the appearance of composure. In fact, the calmer they appeared, the more successful the opium use. And yet, dependence still existed. Letters and diaries hint at secret anxieties. "I fear I am taking too much," one might write, or "The tincture comforts me, yet I am weary of reliance." The veil of respectability often masked real struggle. The quiet epidemic thrived precisely because middle-class society chose to ignore it. Upper-class women. The wealthy? Their experience was almost entirely cosmetic. Opium was available, yes, but they could afford discretion and doctors who monitored dosages. It could also become a fashionable indulgence, tinctures for insomnia, laudanum cocktails at dinner, tonics presented in beautiful glass bottles. For them, addiction could be aesthetic, romanticized, or simply a minor inconvenience. Literary ladies and socialites might be lauded for their delicate frailty, a product of both class privilege and chemical enhancement. Yet even in privilege, dependence could isolate. The upper-class woman might feel trapped between society's expectation of elegance and her body's increasing reliance on laudanum. Letters sometimes hinted melancholy, fatigue, and emotional blunting, revealing that money could not fully protect anyone from the chemical haze. Doctors and class bias. Doctors treated patients differently depending on class. A working-class mother might receive minimal guidance with cheap laudanum dispensed liberally. A middle-class woman might get more careful dosing, but still encouraged to continue the habit. Moral judgment often intersected with class. Poverty was seen as moral weakness, while upper-class dependence was framed as delicate sensibility. Addiction wasn't universal. It was interpreted through the lens of social hierarchy.
And the irony is that the drug itself didn't discriminate. Everyone's body reacted the same way. It was society's perception that drew lines between necessary medicine and moral failing. Children and class. Class also shaped children's exposure. In working-class homes, soothing syrups were often administered liberally, sometimes fatally. In middle and upper-class homes, doses were smaller, more controlled, but still present. Regardless of social status, children often absorbed the domestic dependence around them. Many grew up seeing their mothers rely on tinctures, learning that chemical relief was normal, that suffering could and should be numbed quietly. In a sense, the epidemic was self-perpetuating. The culture of tolerance, combined with the drug's accessibility, ensured the next generation was steeped in the same quiet fog. A quiet social commentary. Victorian opium use among women exposes a stark truth. Social hierarchy determined perception, not reality. The working-class women suffered visibly. The middle-class women suffered invisibly. The wealthy woman suffered aesthetically. And society largely celebrated or condemned based on appearances. The double standard is almost breathtaking. The drug didn't care, but social judgment did. Where we go next. In Part 7, we'll return to individual stories, exploring how specific women navigated class, marriage, and motherhood under the haze. We'll see letters, diary entries, and personal accounts slowly drifting through the private, emotional worlds of women who were rarely allowed to speak freely about pain, dependency, or despair. For now, picture it: a narrow terrace in the East End, a parlor in Bloomsbury, a drawing room in Mayfair. Different rooms, different ceilings, different expectations, but the same brown bottles, the same quiet reliance, the same subtle fog softening reality.
Part 7. Private Lives in the Fog. Women's Stories. So far, we've explored statistics, classes, and the social framework of opium use. Now, let's float into the intimate corners: diaries, letters, and personal accounts that reveal how women actually lived under the chemical haze, not as moral lessons or literary symbols, but as real humans, quietly coping. The governess in Bloomsbury. Imagine a young governess, barely 20, living in a rented room above her employer's home in Bloomsbury. Her day begins before sunrise, tending to children, managing schedules, cleaning, and tutoring. Meals are sparse, her pay meager, and her evenings consist of hours spent alone, weary and anxious. Laudanum offers relief. A teaspoon at night lets her sleep despite her aching back. She might sneak another in the afternoon, just enough to dull the nerves before the children return from school. She writes in her journal, "I fear I lean too heavily on the cordial, but how else to endure the endless hours of silence and watchful eyes?" She is careful. She measures doses, hides the bottle in a drawer, and maintains the polite composure required of her role. To outsiders, she is efficient, attentive, almost serene. Inside, she floats quietly in a chemical fog, surviving each day in measured drops. A middle-class wife in Kensington. Now picture a middle-class wife in Kensington. She has a husband, 2 children, and a tidy home. Social expectations demand that she entertain guests, manage servants, and maintain appearances. She suffers from migraines and anxiety, common complaints that society attributes to delicate female nerves. Her doctor prescribes laudanum. She follows directions carefully: a few drops in tea before dinner, another teaspoon after putting the children to bed. The effect is gentle, nerves steady, mind quiets, and sleep comes. In her letters to friends, she writes carefully, never mentioning the tincture directly. Instead, she writes of relief, of renewed composure, and of the exhaustion of motherhood eased.
She fears the occasional overuse, but society frames her indulgence as sensible, even responsible. The factory worker's wife. Contrast that with a factory worker's wife in Manchester. Long shifts, poorly heated homes, and children crying from hunger and colic. She buys her laudanum from the chemist with the little money she has left after rent and food. She is not delicate. She is tired. She is desperate. A few drops quiet the children. A small dose eases her back and head. Society may judge her if she is discovered, but often she is invisible, a shadow moving through alleys and laundries. Her diary, sparse and utilitarian, reads, "The cordial helps. If I did not take it, I do not know how I could continue. The children sleep, the house is quiet, and I am alive, if only barely." Here, opium is survival, not aesthetic. Her fog is thick, her dependence functional. The effects are felt not only by her, but by the household she maintains under immense pressure. The poet in isolation. Returning to literary women, consider an unmarried poet living alone in a small flat in London. Chronic illness and emotional instability plague her life. Doctors prescribe laudanum to ease pain and induce sleep. She writes furiously by candlelight, manuscripts stacked around her, tincture at hand. The drug both frees her and limits her. Inspiration flows easily, but clarity suffers. Friends remark on her pale complexion, her languid movements, and her melancholic demeanor. She journals, "I find comfort in the drops, yet fear the thin line between clarity and oblivion. Still, the verses come, though perhaps from the bottle as much as from the heart." Opium here becomes both tool and companion. It is part of the creative process, part of the solitude, part of survival. The nurse and her secret. Finally, picture a nurse tending the sick in a London hospital. Shifts are long, patients demanding, and the night stretches endlessly. She suffers from back pain and sleeplessness after years of relentless work. Laudanum is her refuge. She takes just enough to calm nerves before night shifts, to sleep a few hours in the day, to carry on without collapse. No one comments because her duty is never questioned. Society applauds her labor, not the quiet chemical help that keeps her functioning. Her diary reads, "I do not speak of the drops, yet without them I could not endure. They are my secret, my mercy, my companion in the endless night." Here, opium is practical, private, and silently acknowledged only by the woman herself. Patterns in the stories. Across all classes and circumstances, certain patterns emerge. Women use laudanum to manage pain, fatigue, anxiety, and domestic pressure. Dependence is often slow, subtle, and socially tolerated if the woman is respectable. Diaries, letters, and journals reveal guilt, fear, and awareness of reliance. Society often frames addiction differently depending on class, functional in some, tragic in others, aesthetic in the wealthy. The daily life of Victorian women under opium is quiet, private, and rarely scandalous. Addiction is woven into the fabric of survival, shaping routines, behaviors, and appearances without public fanfare. Drifting through the decades. By the 1880s and 1890s, awareness of opium's risks increased. Regulations slowly tightened. Doctors became more cautious. Yet the cultural patterns, women hidden in private spaces, managing pain with chemicals, children quietly sedated, persisted. The epidemic, once invisible, began to shrink, but its traces lingered. In literature, in art, in social memory. And for the women themselves, it left a quiet mark, a life lived through tiny vials, measured drops, and private relief. A pause before Part 8. So, as we drift toward Part 8, hold on to the image. The governess, the middle-class wife, the factory worker, the poet, the nurse, all moving through their days under a subtle chemical fog. Their lives may seem ordinary, almost mundane, but beneath the surface is a quiet complexity, a dependency that shaped their existence. Next, we'll explore the broader cultural echoes, public reaction, the fading epidemic, and how history remembers or forgets these women.
Part 8. The Decline, Memory and the Lingering Shadow. So we've wandered through parlors, nurseries, factories, and literary flats, following women whose lives were shaped, subtly or profoundly, by laudanum. Now let's drift into the later decades of the Victorian era and see how opium use among women began to change, and how it left a cultural echo long after the bottles were gone. Toward regulation. By the 1880s and 1890s, a mix of medical research, social commentary, and occasional scandal began to focus attention on opium use. Reports of child deaths from soothing syrups, along with mounting concern about dependence in adults, pushed lawmakers to consider regulation. The first steps were cautious. Pharmacists were asked to record sales. Labels began to carry vague warnings. Doctors were encouraged to limit prescriptions. It was, in true Victorian fashion, more about appearances than enforcement. Regulations existed, but lax oversight meant that access remained relatively easy, particularly for women of the middle and upper classes. Nevertheless, the period marked a shift. Laudanum was no longer entirely invisible or unquestioned. Society began to recognize that women's reliance on the drug, while quietly tolerated, had real consequences. Changing medicine. By the turn of the century, medicine was evolving. Aspirin, new sedatives, and a better understanding of dosage reduced the reliance on opium. Doctors increasingly viewed prolonged use as a medical problem rather than simply a symptom of delicate nerves. This medical shift, combined with social pressure and the slow rise of alternative therapies, began to shrink the quiet epidemic. Women's daily dependence on laudanum decreased, though it did not disappear entirely. For decades afterward, opium remained part of domestic medicine, but its dominance waned. Cultural memory. As the epidemic faded, Victorian culture began to reshape how it remembered women's opium use. The domestic, private nature of the habit meant that it rarely became scandalous. Instead, it became literary and aesthetic. The pale, frail woman, her delicate health accentuated by tincture, transformed into a symbol of refinement and tragedy. Art and literature carried these images forward, swooning figures, melancholy muses, and frail heroines. The real women, mothers, nurses, factory workers, governesses, faded from public memory, leaving only the archetypes. In this sense, laudanum left an enduring imprint not on statistics, but on imagination. It shaped how femininity, fragility, and endurance were culturally imagined. Social reflection. Looking back, the epidemic also reveals much about Victorian society itself. It shows the pressures women faced: rigid domestic expectations, limited agency, exhausting labor, and minimal medical understanding. Laudanum provided relief, but also highlights the inequality inherent in the system. Class, gender, and respectability all dictated how use was perceived. The working-class woman's dependence was judged harshly.
The middle-class woman's was tolerated, even encouraged. The wealthy woman's could be aestheticized. In every case, social norms mediated both perception and experience. Echoes into the 20th century. Even after regulation tightened, the cultural echo persisted. Early 20th century fiction and social commentary often referenced the opium pale lady archetype. Later depictions of addiction, whether in novels, plays, or cinema, borrowed from the Victorian image of fragile, dependent women rather than purely medical or social reality. The personal legacy. For the women themselves, the legacy was subtle but real. Many lived long lives quietly shaped by decades of chemical dependence. Some overcame it, others carried its effects into old age. Letters, diaries, and family recollections hint at fatigue, emotional blunting, and the lingering shadow of reliance. Yet they persisted, worked, loved, and endured even as history largely forgot them. Their stories are hidden in archives, tucked into prescription records, or faintly present in literature and art. And for those who do notice, the lesson is both simple and poignant. Survival often required adaptation, sometimes in ways invisible to the outside world. A final image. So let's pause one last time in the dim glow of Victorian London. Picture a quiet street at dusk, gas lamps flickering. In one home, a governess folds sheets and doses herself gently. In another, a mother whispers to her children and sets aside the soothing syrup. In a literary flat, a poet dips her pen in ink and rests her hand on a small brown bottle. Across classes, circumstances, and decades, women relied on opium to endure the unrelenting expectations of society. It was private, functional, and largely invisible. And though society forgot their names, the quiet haze they lived in shaped domestic life, literature, and cultural memory for generations. Closing thoughts. Victorian women and opium offer a lesson in subtlety. Addiction was not always dramatic or public. Sometimes it was hidden in teaspoons and nighttime rituals. Sometimes it was beautiful, tragic, mundane, and utterly human. And sometimes, looking back, we recognize it not as scandal, but as survival. A chemical lifeline for women navigating impossible pressures. As the city sleeps under fog and gaslight, the echo of those lives lingers. Their stories, faint and fragile, are part of the hidden history of London, the Empire, and the women who bore its burdens quietly, one measured drop at a time.
Part 9. Reflections and the Quiet Legacy. As we near the end of our slow wander through Victorian London, it's worth pausing to reflect on what we've seen. The fog of laudanum, the soft clink of glass bottles, the quiet endurance of women navigating impossible expectations. The story of Victorian women and opium is not sensational. There are no grand battles, no explosive scandals. Instead, it's a story of subtle survival, private coping, and invisible labor. It's the hum of life softened by tincture, the quiet fog that allowed people to persist, to function, to endure. The human pattern. Across class and circumstance, we notice patterns that feel almost universal. Women used opium to manage pain, both physical and emotional. Children were sedated, sometimes inadvertently, as part of survival in the household. Dependence was often slow, quiet, and socially invisible in respectable circles. Diaries and letters reveal both awareness and guilt, but also relief and functionality. What emerges is not tragedy in the theatrical sense, but tragedy in the quiet, human sense. Lives constrained by duty, expectation, and limited medical knowledge found a chemical ally in laudanum.
society's blind eye. Victorian society looked in some directions and not others. Opium dens and foreign addicts were dramatized, feared, and caricatured. Respectable women, quietly taking doses at home, were often ignored, tolerated, or even praised for their composure. Class and gender framed perception. The working-class mother's dependence was seen as failure or moral weakness. The middle-class wife's reliance was quietly accepted. The wealthy woman's use could be aestheticized or romanticized. And yet the chemical reality was the same. Opium did not discriminate. Only human judgment did. Literature, art, and memory. The cultural imprint is perhaps the most lasting legacy. Art, novels, poetry, and plays preserved the aesthetic of the pale, fragile, laudanum-using woman. Real lives of nurses, governesses, mothers, and poets blurred into archetypes. The fog of laudanum became a literary and artistic metaphor, a symbol of fragility, melancholy, and endurance. Later generations inherited this imagery without always recognizing the human experiences beneath it. The modern lens. Looking back from today, it's tempting to judge or moralize, but in truth, these women were navigating constraints imposed by class, gender, and social expectation. Opium was neither glamorous nor scandalous in their daily lives. It was functional, private, and quietly necessary. It's a lesson in subtlety. Survival can take many forms. What appears in hindsight as aesthetic or symbolic was once deeply practical. It reminds us that history is lived, not just narrated. The enduring image. So as we drift toward the close, imagine one last scene. The city, under gaslight and fog, a mother rocking a baby quietly asleep, her tincture beside her. A governess folds linens, her hand occasionally brushing a small brown bottle hidden in the drawer. A poet dips her pen in ink, pauses, and touches the glass vial at her side. Across streets, homes, and social strata, lives were quietly shaped by necessity and survival. The fog of laudanum softened the world, muted pain, and enabled endurance. And while history may forget the names, the traces remain. In literature, in cultural memory, in the very way we imagine Victorian fragility. Closing thoughts. Victorian women and opium offer a story of quiet resilience. It is not dramatic. It is not sensational. It is subtle, human, and profoundly intimate. It teaches us about endurance, about the hidden labor of women, and about how society can simultaneously ignore and depend on the very behaviors it claims to condemn. So tonight, as you drift off, perhaps picture the faint glow of a London gas lamp, the quiet clink of a bottle, and the lives of women who navigated expectation, duty, and pain, one measured drop at a time. Sleep gently with that image. The world continues outside, but here, history floats in a soft chemical fog, and the past rests quietly, waiting for no one.
Part 10. Epilogue. Echoes beyond the fog. Even after laudanum faded from daily Victorian life, its imprint lingered. The bottles were discarded or hidden, the tinctures replaced by newer medications, and the women who once depended on them moved on, passed away, or left traces only in diaries, letters, and literary echoes. But cultural memory has a long shelf life, especially for Victorian England. Society remembered not the daily grind of nursing, laundry, and childcare under chemical haze, but the image of the delicate, ethereal, suffering woman. The myth versus the reality. History often prefers the myth. Paintings of swooning women, novels featuring fragile heroines, and poetry celebrating melancholy became shorthand for Victorian femininity. In reality, most women were pragmatist.
balancing labor, domestic responsibility, and physical pain. Opium was a tool, not a lifestyle. It was often about endurance, not decadence. There's a quiet irony here. Society romanticized fragility while ignoring the mechanisms, chemical or otherwise, that produced it. The very act of survival was rendered aesthetic. A mother quieting her child with a drop of cordial became a literary trope, her practical life recast as artful tragedy. Lessons in society. The opium epidemic among women also offers a subtle social lesson. It highlights the intersection of gender, class, and medical authority. Women's bodies were expected to perform, endure, and conform. Class determined both access to relief and societal judgment. Medicine was a tool, a comfort, and sometimes an unacknowledged crutch. The angel in the house ideal, serene, patient, delicate, was chemically, socially, and culturally constructed. Laudanum smoothed the rough edges of expectation, allowing survival but also perpetuating invisibility. Cultural aftershocks. Even after opium use waned, the cultural echoes persisted. Literature continued to reference the pale, ethereal woman as a symbol of sensitivity and melancholy. Art preserved faint, swooning figures, often divorced from the reality of chemical dependence. Later narratives of addiction borrowed from the Victorian archetype, reinforcing gendered assumptions about fragility and coping. In essence, opium shaped not just bodies, but imagination. It left behind a template of femininity that extended far beyond the century. Personal shadows. The women themselves left subtler traces. Diaries reveal small victories and quiet struggles. Letters hint at both gratitude and guilt for the chemical support that helped them endure. Their lives were ordinary in many ways, yet extraordinary in the persistence, creativity, and care they showed while navigating dependency, domestic pressure, and societal expectation. History may forget individual names, but the patterns, the emotional textures, and the lived experience remain visible if one looks closely. The shadow of laudanum is more cultural than chemical now, but it still shapes how we imagine the past. A gentle closing. As we settle into the quiet of this epilogue, picture one last scene. The streets of London in soft fog, the gas lamps casting faint halos. In a small flat, a woman writes by candlelight, a tiny bottle of tincture beside her. Upstairs, a mother soothes her child with measured drops. Across town, a governess folds linens and pauses, hand resting on a hidden vial. They are gone. The bottles are empty. The fog has lifted. And yet in art, in literature, in the echoes of cultural memory, they remain. Fragile, enduring, quietly human. History, after all, is not only the record of events. It's the soft traces left behind in daily life, the small choices made under pressure, the quiet acts of survival. And for Victorian women, opium was both a tool and a companion in that survival. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the faint glow of those gas lamps, the soft clink of a bottle, and the quiet endurance of women navigating impossible lives. Their world is past, but their shadow lingers, soft, subtle, and in a way, strangely comforting. Sleep gently. Let the fog of history wash over you, and remember, even survival has its own quiet beauty.
Part 11. Shadows, Myths, and the Quiet Aftermath. Even as the 20th century dawned and laudanum receded from daily life, the echoes of Victorian opium use persisted, both in memory and myth. By now, the world had changed. New medicines, stricter regulations, and shifting social norms reshaped how women coped with pain, fatigue, and societal expectation. Yet cultural imagination is stubborn. The faint, ethereal, chemically aided Victorian woman remained a touchstone in literature, theater, and later, film. She became shorthand for fragility, melancholy,
and endurance, even as the real women who inspired her lived, suffered, and survived largely unnoticed. The myth of fragility. Society loved its archetypes. Victorian women's reliance on opium was subtly woven into the image of female delicacy. Pale complexions, languid movements, quiet suffering. These became aesthetic ideals divorced from their chemical origins. Writers, painters, and playwrights perpetuated these images. The fainting woman, the swooning heroine, the melancholy muse. They were not necessarily real depictions, but symbols. And like most symbols, they carried authority. People assumed the fragility was inherent, not medicated. Ironically, this myth reinforced societal expectations. Women were expected to be delicate, sensitive, and enduring, and laudanum had once helped them achieve this. The chemical scaffold had vanished, but the cultural ideal remained. Broader social reflections. Looking back, opium use among Victorian women highlights several subtle truths about society. Pain and fatigue were often medicalized as female weakness. Chemical solutions were tolerated when they preserved social order. Class shaped perception. What was aesthetic for the wealthy was functional for the working class. In a quiet way, laudanum reveals both the ingenuity and the limitations of women navigating oppressive social structures. It was a tool of survival, a bridge between expectation and endurance, and a lens through which society projected its values. The silent legacy. Many women carried the personal legacy of laudanum use into old age. Some recovered fully, others experienced lingering effects, emotional blunting, subtle dependence, or health complications. Family letters sometimes hint at gratitude, sometimes at quiet regret. These personal shadows, though never acknowledged publicly, are part of the historical record. They remind us that history is not only made in the public sphere, but also in the intimate private acts of endurance. Modern echoes. Even today, traces remain in cultural memory. The archetype of the fragile, suffering, or melancholy woman has persisted in literature, film, and art, often disconnected from reality. Addiction is still gendered in perception, reflecting patterns first visible in Victorian society. By understanding these echoes, we gain insight not only into history, but also into how society interprets female fragility, dependence, and endurance, even centuries later. A final reflection. Imagine one last tableau. The gas lights dim, the city quiet. A mother tends her sleeping child. A poet traces lines on paper, her hand brushing the tiny brown bottle once necessary to endure life's pressures. A governess pauses in the lamplight, her thoughts drifting across the years she spent quietly surviving. Their lives were ordinary in most senses, extraordinary in their resilience. They navigated societal expectation, domestic pressure, and personal suffering with subtle courage, often unseen. And while the bottles are gone and the tinctures replaced, the faint echo of their experience lingers, in literature, in memory, and in the quiet understanding that survival sometimes requires invisible chemical assistance. Sleep with that image tonight. Delicate, fragile, enduring, quietly human. Victorian women lived in fog, and perhaps in their shadows we can glimpse the beauty of quiet endurance.
Part 12. Medicine, Gender, and the Fog of Memory. By the early 20th century, Victorian opium use among women had largely faded, replaced by new medicines, evolving medical advice, and stricter regulation.
Laudanum, once a daily companion for countless women, receded quietly from domestic life. And yet, the traces remained, not in headlines, not in scandals, but in subtle cultural memory and ongoing gendered assumptions about fragility, endurance, and dependence. Medicine as a mirror. Laudanum's role illustrates an important pattern. Medicine does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by culture, expectation, and gender. Women's pain was often seen as emotional rather than physical. Doctors prescribed laudanum liberally, partly to soothe symptoms, partly to maintain social order. Dependence was tolerated when it preserved propriety and productivity. In other words, medicine was a mirror. It reflected societal assumptions as much as it addressed biological reality. And women, as usual, navigated both sides of the mirror, adjusting, coping, surviving. Gendered perceptions. Society's perception of addiction remains gendered, even today, and Victorian laudanum use was an early illustration of this pattern. The working-class woman, dependence judged as moral weakness or failure. The middle-class wife, dependence tolerated, sometimes even praised for maintaining composure. The wealthy woman, dependence aestheticized, romanticized, woven into literary and artistic tropes. The chemical reality, drops of tincture, teaspoons of comfort, was identical in many cases, only social perception changed. The quiet persistence of archetypes. Even after opium use declined, the archetype persisted. Frail, pale, melancholic, ethereal. Literature, theater, and later cinema recycled this image, often forgetting the ordinary, hard-working, surviving women behind it. This persistence highlights how cultural memory selects for drama, aesthetics, and morality rather than lived experience. The faint echoes of laudanum use survived in images, stories, and societal expectations long after the bottles were empty. Lessons from the fog. What can we glean from these faint chemical shadows? Survival often requires adaptation, sometimes invisible, sometimes misunderstood. Society interprets endurance differently depending on gender and class. Personal coping strategies, chemical or otherwise, can leave lasting cultural traces even when the practical need has vanished. In other words, history is not only the record of events, but the subtle imprint of daily life. Victorian women's quiet reliance on laudanum is a testament to endurance, ingenuity, and resilience under pressure. Final mental images. As we drift toward the ultimate close, imagine once more a governess in Bloomsbury, her small vial hidden in a drawer, moving through chores with quiet efficiency. A mother in Kensington, her children asleep, drops of tincture at her side, the house serene. A poet in a candle-lit flat, tracing lines on paper, her hand occasionally brushing the glass bottle that once enabled creativity. Each scene is ordinary, almost mundane, yet each is extraordinary in its subtle endurance. The fog may lift, the bottles may vanish, but the human story remains, one of quiet adaptation, resilience, and survival in a world of rigid expectation. Sleep with that thought tonight, that history is not only battles and scandals, but also the faint, enduring echoes of everyday courage, invisible to most, sustained quietly, one measured drop at a time.
Part 13. The Ultimate Reflection.
Enduring shadows. As we drift toward the end of this long journey through Victorian London, it's worth pausing one last time to consider what we've witnessed. The lives of women quietly navigating duty, expectation, and chemical aid. The domestic fog of laudanum that softened reality. And the cultural echoes that outlasted both the bottles and the century. This is a story not of scandal, nor of drama, but of endurance, of invisible adaptation, and of survival under conditions that were often unfair, exhausting, and invisible to outsiders. Survival in a bottle. Across classes, ages, and circumstances, women used opium to endure the relentless pressures of Victorian life. A few drops could smooth anxiety, dull physical pain, or quiet restless children. Laudanum was a tool of survival, practical, quiet, and largely invisible. For some, it was almost aesthetic. The pale, languid, ethereal ideal admired in literature and art. For others, it was functional, a lifeline in a world of labor, domestic expectation, and societal scrutiny. And for nearly all, it was private, a companion in moments that no one else would witness. The intersection of class and gender. We have seen that class shaped both experience and perception. Working-class women were judged harshly, their dependence interpreted as moral weakness. Middle-class women were largely tolerated, their composure preserved by small doses and privacy. Upper-class women could even be romanticized, their fragility aestheticized and celebrated. The chemical reality did not change. Only society's gaze did. And in that gaze, we see both bias and blind spots, illustrating the complex intersection of gender, class, and medicine in Victorian culture. The cultural aftermath. Even as opium receded from daily life, its shadow persisted in imagination and culture. Literature immortalized the frail, swooning, melancholic woman. Art and theater echoed the aesthetic of delicate endurance. Later generations inherited these images, often divorced from the lived reality of daily survival. In essence, laudanum shaped not only bodies, but imagination and memory, leaving an imprint far beyond its chemical effects. Personal stories and lingering echoes. The governess in Bloomsbury, the mother in Kensington, the factory worker in Manchester, the poet in her flat, the nurse tending the sick. They are all gone. Yet their lives, quietly managed under chemical haze, persist in faint traces. Letters, diaries, literary archetypes, and the subtle imprint on cultural memory. Their endurance, though invisible to society, is palpable to us now. Measured drops, quiet resilience, private coping. They remind us that history is lived in the ordinary as much as the extraordinary, and that human adaptation often leaves the most lasting marks. The gentle moral. Perhaps the quiet lesson here is this: survival is rarely dramatic. Endurance is often unseen. Coping mechanisms, whether chemical, emotional, or practical, may go unnoticed, but they are vital. Victorian women used laudanum not for thrill nor for indulgence, but to meet life's relentless demands with composure and grace. And maybe that's the most human part of history. Not the battles, the scandals, or the triumphs, but the quiet, enduring traces of quiet survival. So, tonight,
As you drift off, let that quiet endurance settle around you like fog over the Thames, soft, subtle, and strangely comforting. Sleep gently. Part 14. Beyond the Bottles. Societal Reflections. By the time the 20th century fully arrived, laudanum and other opium-based medicines had largely disappeared from daily use. Regulations, new pharmaceuticals, and changing medical understanding slowly displaced what had once been a quiet, ubiquitous chemical companion for Victorian women. And yet, the social and cultural shadows remained. Society had internalized lessons, myths, and expectations shaped by decades of private dependence. The faint echoes of those bottles lingered, shaping ideas of femininity, fragility, and endurance. Medicine, morality, and gender. Victorian opium use reveals an interesting pattern in the intersection of medicine, morality, and gender. Medical practice often prioritized social order over individual autonomy. Women's reliance on opium was tolerated when it preserved composure, productivity, and domestic harmony. Judgments about addiction were rarely objective. They reflected class, gender, and societal expectation more than physiology. In other words, medicine both alleviated suffering and reinforced social hierarchies. Laudanum was as much a social tool as a chemical one. Cultural memory and misperception. Even after the chemical necessity faded, the cultural memory persisted. Literature and theater continued to romanticize fragile, melancholic women. Artistic representations often divorced the aesthetic from the practical reality of survival. Later narratives of female dependence borrowed heavily from Victorian archetypes, perpetuating gendered assumptions about fragility and coping. This demonstrates a subtle truth. Cultural memory often preserves myth more easily than lived experience. The faint fog of laudanum became a lens through which femininity, endurance, and emotional delicacy were imagined for generations. The invisible work of women. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is about invisible labor. Victorian women's reliance on opium was not a moral failing, nor a scandalous indulgence. It was part of a larger pattern of coping with expectation. Long hours of domestic work, emotional labor, and childcare. Limited access to medical care and societal support. Constant pressure to maintain appearances regardless of personal suffering. Laudanum was a quiet ally, a tool of endurance. Its use underscores how women's labor, emotional, physical, and social, was often invisible, even as it structured the rhythms of domestic and public life. Reflection across time. Looking back, the Victorian opium epidemic among women is instructive. It reminds us that survival is rarely glamorous, and coping mechanisms are often unseen. It highlights the interplay of social expectation, medical practice, and individual resilience. It also asks us to reconsider modern assumptions about dependence and addiction, the context, the pressures, and the invisible work that shapes human experience. Final scene for Part 14. As we drift toward the close of this extended reflection, imagine once more a gaslit street in foggy London, silent except for distant footsteps. A mother gently rocking her child, drops of tincture in a tiny bottle beside her. A governess folding sheets, hand brushing a hidden vial. A poet tracing words on paper, inspired as much by the fog of life as by any chemical aid. They are gone now, and the bottles are empty. But the faint traces remain, in literature, in cultural memory, and in our understanding of endurance, resilience, and the quiet strategies humans use to survive. Sleep with that thought tonight, that history is soft, subtle, and often invisible, like fog over the Thames, quiet, enduring, and strangely comforting.
Part 15. The Gentle Close. Echoes of the Fog. As we drift to the final moments of our long journey, let's settle once more into the quiet streets of Victorian London, fog curling around gas lamps, and the soft hum of domestic life continuing behind closed doors. We have followed women across classes: governesses, mothers, nurses, poets, and factory workers. We have peeked into their private routines, their diaries, their letters, and their quiet coping mechanisms. And through it all, laudanum was a silent companion, subtle, practical, and often invisible to the world outside. The enduring threads. Across all these lives, several threads emerge. Survival. Women used laudanum to endure pain, fatigue, and emotional strain. Privacy. Dependence was largely hidden, quietly managed, and socially tolerated when discreet. Perception. Class and gender shaped how society viewed chemical aid, often misunderstanding or romanticizing reality. Cultural echo. Even after the bottles emptied, literature, art, and imagination preserved the archetype of the delicate, melancholy woman. The chemical fog may have lifted, but the faint imprint remains on memory, on culture, and in the way we imagine endurance and fragility. Reflection on human endurance. Perhaps the most profound lesson is that endurance is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, private, and often invisible to the world. Survival requires subtle strategies, tiny compromises, and small comforts. In this sense, Victorian women and laudanum teach us that resilience can be measured in teaspoons and small vials as much as in heroic deeds or public triumphs. They remind us that the ordinary rhythms of life, the domestic labor, emotional care, and personal struggle, are themselves extraordinary. A last mental image. Picture one final tableau. A mother sits by her child, softly humming, tincture beside her, the room dimly lit. A governess folds sheets in silence, glancing once at a small brown bottle tucked away in a drawer. A poet dips her pen in ink, hand resting near the vial that once eased her pain and inspired her words. The fog of life, the fog of laudanum, has lifted. The bottles are empty. The women have gone. And yet their quiet endurance, their resilience, and their subtle strategies for survival echo softly through history. History is not only grand events or dramatic moments. It is also the quiet shadows of ordinary lives, the gentle fogs that shaped experience, and the invisible acts that allowed people to endure. Sleep with this thought. Tonight, as you drift off, imagine the faint glow of gas lamps, the quiet streets, and the lives that persisted behind closed doors. Imagine survival in measured drops, endurance in soft gestures, and resilience in the face of relentless expectation. Victorian women lived, survived, and sometimes thrived under the subtle fog of laudanum. Their stories are soft, quiet, and enduring, like history itself. Sleep gently, let the fog settle, and carry with you the calm knowledge that even ordinary life can leave extraordinary traces.